One of the neighbors asked him, "Are you Korean?" And when he responded that he was, this neighbor cursed at him in mocking Korean. The angry mob dragged them out of their home and then brutally attacked the grandmother. Both of them were beaten unconscious. Even though this family faced retaliation and worse, they stood up for themselves and they called law enforcement. Ultimately, the perpetrators pled guilty and they were all sentenced. We can't make change if they can't hear us. We must be seen. We must be heard. This is our home.
이 콘텐츠는 아시안 증오범죄 근절 프로그램의 일환으로 캘리포니아주에서 지원받아 제작되었습니다.
I'm a proud Korean American. I'm a survivor. I'm a voice for the unheard. My parents, both immigrants from Seoul, ultimately made our home in the Koreatown area of Los Angeles in 1984. When I was in Koreatown, I felt like I was at home, with all the comforts of Korean food and community to keep my heritage going strong. I loved how connected we felt. When the riots happened in 1992, I was in the 5th grade attending school at the edge of Koreatown. I woke up to ashes. My dad drove my mom, my sister, and me in the car to take a good look at his office, to see if it had been destroyed from the relentless rage that had gone through Koreatown through the nights. Fortunately, his office was spared, but the stores we frequented had been shattered, pillaged, destroyed. If my parents were worried, concerned, or bitter, I had no idea. They hid it well. This is who they were. They kept their heads down, they made sure we focused on school, and they got right back to business as usual to work through this adversity. Looking back, I imagine that many of the Koreatown business owners may have wondered, do we really belong in America? Isn't this Los Angeles? Isn't this supposed to be one of the most diverse cities in the world? Fast forward, after law school in Chicago, I returned home and interned in the hate crimes unit of the LADA's office under someone who became one of my most influential mentors, Deputy District Attorney George Castello. My clerkship at the DA's office took me all across LA County. I remember one day, George told me we were going to La Crescenta. It's a suburb just 20 miles northeast of Los Angeles. Many Koreans chose to live there for the proximity to Los Angeles and the good school district. A sheriff's detective met us at a home where I met a Korean family. I'll call them the C family for today's purposes. 2 parents, 2 daughters, and 1 grandmother. They recounted the numerous times they had to call the police because the neighbors would have parties with extended family members all through the night, causing disturbance to their children and the rest of the family. The C's couldn't sleep. Initially, they didn't want to involve law enforcement, but they reached their breaking point and called the police to intervene after trying to tell their neighbors to stop the loud parties. The neighbors began to harass the C's as payback. They called them derogatory names like gooks. They intentionally honked their horns as they passed by the C's home, and they spat at the C's home. On Christmas Eve of 2007, the neighbors had another late night party, and the C father asked them to be quiet. One of the neighbors asked him, "Are you Korean?" And when he responded that he was, this neighbor cursed at him in mocking Korean. The neighbors then threw objects at the C's windows. Moments later, more than a dozen of the neighbors' families showed up at the C's front door, and some of the men knocked on the front door. When the C father answered, they dragged him out, and he was repeatedly punched by at least 4 of the men. One of the female neighbors yelled out obscenities and called the C's gooks, while another male asked the C father, "You want to die?" The grandmother and mother tried to help. The angry mob dragged them out of their home and then brutally attacked the grandmother and continued to attack the father. Both of them were beaten unconscious. Several of the grandmother's teeth were knocked loose, and she received stitches to her lip. I remember going to court and watching the testimony unfold. The Korean interpreter, he was not interpreting accurately what the victim was saying. He was lazily summarizing. I was still just a clerk, but I nudged George and he approached the judge to get a new interpreter. I realized at that point that representation was important in the system, not just in skin color, but in experience. This is a moment when I wished my Korean was better than it was, but my understanding of Korean was a simple but crucial part of this family being heard. Ultimately, the perpetrators pled guilty and they were all sentenced. Even though this family faced retaliation and worse, they stood up for themselves and they called law enforcement. This case was bigger than the C family. It impacted my life. It made me realize that if a family with no legal knowledge was willing to stand up and demand justice, what kind of impact could I make as a prosecutor? From that experience, I made a vow to be a prosecutor who helps people, especially those who could not understand or navigate the criminal justice system. At the first step of my journey, I had to navigate other biases in the system. When I applied to the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, everything fell into place. When I got the offer and took the oath to become a deputy district attorney, I had the best time. Work didn't feel like work because we were told to always seek justice ethically, no matter the wins or losses, while also protecting the rights of the criminally accused. But when I was assigned to the downtown courthouse as a second-year prosecutor, I recalled a case where a Korean liquor store owner was harassed by gang members frequently. They would come into the store and take whatever they wanted without paying. It was expected to pay for these unspoken taxes when you operate a business in gang territory. One day the store owner had had enough, and he told them that they had to pay for the things they took. They threatened him. They shoved a display case with food. After the hearing took place, the judge made a passing comment to me that this was a price of doing business in certain parts of LA for your people. This judge thought this case shouldn't even be a felony. I try to make sense of what he meant. Somehow, Korean business owners aren't victims if they choose to do business in rough parts of LA, right? That's what he was saying. After all, they chose to open a business there, right? After over a decade in this line of work, I've tried to bring some sense of justice to those who lost their loved ones to the most heinous abuse and the senseless murders, or to the families who were broken by the trauma of generational domestic violence. When I look at my old colleagues, I'm certain we stayed committed to the work because the satisfaction is obtaining some sense of justice, some sense of closure for the victims and their families, especially when they suffer from the most unimaginable crimes. When the rise of reported hate incidents and hate crimes against Asians was all over the media during the pandemic, it brought back the memories I had from the '92 riots. The difference I saw this time was that the 1.5 and second generation Asian Americans were speaking out and mobilizing to build upon the change of what our parents' generation had already done. I was proud to see what many of the community leaders have done both locally and nationally to bring awareness and resources to help Asian Americans report the incidents and crimes and to provide services. There is more work to be done, however. There has to be accountability among the leaders that we elect and the judges that sit on the bench, deciding cases that have lasting effects on our communities. I can say this with absolute certainty after I was a victim of a violent crime. In August of 2020, during the height of the pandemic, I was assaulted by a man who had a repeated history of brutally assaulting other women. I was walking with a friend from work to grab coffee at Starbucks just 3 blocks from the courthouse when a man came up behind me and punched me so hard I thought a car or a bicyclist had collided into my back. I cried so hard and couldn't make out any words, but thankfully a security guard pepper sprayed my attacker and detained him until the police arrived 45 minutes later. After he was arrested, I was notified that he had attacked 3 women prior to me, all unsuspecting women. One with a metal pipe, another with a golf club, and yet another with a hammer. And he was on felony probation for these attacks. Despite his clear history against women, the judge kept letting him out. He was supposed to be receiving treatment at a mental health facility, but even after he'd left the program, the same judge continued to give him chances at the expense of my safety and the safety of other women he had come across. This system that I worked in for so long and believed in let me down. Even though I asked the judge, how many more women did this defendant have to hurt for it to matter to this court? She scoffed at me. After I gave my statement, we were off the record, and she made a snide remark about remembering that this case involved a DA in the building, her tone insinuating that DAs like me could not be victims. I was listening to the judge's remarks and wondering how a person who was sworn to uphold the justice system and the rights of victims could be so insensitive and blind to the dangerous consequences of her decision-making. Of course, the judge let my attacker go back to the program right after he attacked me, and he was able to leave the program once again. The judge inappropriately sentenced him to a light sentence. Just about 7 months after he was carelessly paroled, he attacked yet another woman. This time, he nearly blinded an Olympian who was minding her own business and forever changed the course of her life. This was a predator who preyed upon women and was not held accountable by the system that is meant to protect us. I thought to myself, if I went through this, what must everyday people think about our system? But I don't want you to be discouraged. But we must all know that enough is enough. For change to happen, we cannot sit on the sidelines. I absolutely see how this system is not perfect, and I know without a doubt that we all must speak up. So many are counting on you. All of us must do our part as a community, because if they can't see us, how can they hear us? How can we be seen? So what can we do? Tell your family. You are survivors, not just victims. I've heard of many stories where Korean grandmas and grandpas are afraid to tell their own children if they've been a victim of an assault or robbery or racial slurs. You brought us to this country to give us a better life. Help us advocate for you. Secondly, report the crimes. The only way that the police departments and the city, county, and state leaders know this is a problem is if we tell them. They will rely on the data to show where the resources need to be spent. So for example, if there's a 500% increase in reported hate incidents or assaults in Koreatown, they have no choice but to provide services there or resources there. Also, know your community resources. There are programs and resources readily available. Organizations like KAFLA, the Korean Federation, KFAM, the Korean American Family Services, KAWA, the Korean American Women's Association, KYCC, the Koreatown Youth Community Center. These are all in Los Angeles. These are places in Koreatown that are ready to advocate for you and provide support for mental health, housing, families in need, and many of them can also help if there are barriers to reporting, such as needing the moral support or language assistance. Be civically engaged. It's not enough just to vote. I say this to our parents' generation and to my peers who have moved away from the area. In order to have a generational impact for your kids, your grandkids, their kids, you need to know what are the policies being passed and promoted by our leaders. And to the student population, we need more Korean prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges, more informed fighters for justice who will protect victims while advocating for fair treatment across the board. And I want to end with this. We can't make change if they can't hear us. We must be seen. We must be heard. This is our home. Let us rise up together and let us leave a strong legacy for the next generation. Thank you.
이 콘텐츠는 아시안 증오범죄 근절 프로그램의 일환으로 캘리포니아주에서 지원받아 제작되었습니다.